be able to welcome Adam Newton to campus. I have wanted to bring Adam for many years, and I'm really thrilled that this finally has been able to materialize. So Adam is the university professor emeritus at Yeshiva University, and more recently the distinguished visiting professor at Emory University Center for Humanistic Inquiry, and the Kirk Distinguished Visiting Scholar at Agnes Scott College. He chaired the English department at Yeshiva from 2007 to 2015, and was previously the Blumberg Centennial Professor of English at the University of Texas at Austin, which is when I actually first met Adam, and have since been a regular and really very avid reader of his work, and you will see why shortly. I am not going to mention every article that Adam has written, but I did actually want to note the books. There are 6 books, all of which are major publications, and I think just in hearing the titles alone, you will get a sense both of the breadth and the range, and also the intellectual vitality of his work. That, again, I am certain we'll all have a chance to get a bit of a taste of. So this is in order of publication, and I think in there is a certain intellectual genealogy trajectory that I am also imagining we might be hearing a bit of, traces of it in the talk today. The first book, Narrative Ethics, came out with Harvard University Press in 1995. That was followed by the book Facing Black and Jew, Literature as a Public Space in 20th Century America, which was published by Cambridge University Press in '99. After that, The Fence and the Neighbor, Emmanuel Levinas, Yeshayahu Leibovitz, and Israel Among the Nations, that came out in 2001 with SUNY Press. And then The Elsewhere, On Belonging at a Near Distance, University of Wisconsin, 2005. And then To Make the Hands Impure, Art, Ethical Adventure, The Difficult and the Holy, that appeared in 2014 with Fordham. And then finally, and Adam, I don't know if it's actually, is it physically out yet, or is it almost out? Okay, great. The best books are those that are almost out, are about to materialize. Jewish Studies as Counterlife, a report to the Academy. I should add that there are traces here of Roth and Kafka scattered throughout the other publications, and really a remarkable range of thinkers, ideas, and conceptual ways of approaching the question of what constitutes Jewish study. So I'm really delighted to be able to welcome Adam, and I'm going to turn it over to you for your talk. Thank you again.
My wife and I arrived last night and ended up sleeping with our toddler. So who's off to sleep, as was I last night. So I'm sleepless in Minnesota, Minneapolis. Also, I apologize in advance.
Louder.
What? Louder? I apologize in advance for the maybe too formal cast to the talk I'm about to give, but for an intimate gathering like this. But I hope you'll indulge me. You know, I'm not going to use my glasses. In a recent book about the agency of becoming, philosopher Agnes Callard distinguishes between ambition, the virtue that enables agents to make large-scale changes in the world without coming to learn why they are doing so, and aspiration, moral disposition in the form of a learning process, by which the aspirant refashions a self, thereby acquiring or maturing into a revised set of values. I speak to you today as just that sort of aspirant. My subject is Jewish studies, on whose behalf I will take the liberty or seize the chutzpah of aspiring. Today's talk is intended to complement my recently completed project, Jewish Studies as Counterlife, a report to the Academy, forthcoming this summer from Fordham University Press. And there's a mock-up of the cover and back cover and the table of contents going around the room. I have to say that the opportunity to share this material in advance, or some of this material, feels both timely and revivifying. So I thank Leslie Morris and Minnesota Center for Jewish Studies for the opportunity to do so, and I thank you all for attending. I hope it's worth your while. My title, Jewish Studies as a Problem to Itself, which actually denotes a good thing, has its source in Wir Philologen, We Philologists, a posthumous work from 1875 by Friedrich Nietzsche, who wrote, "Philologists, when discussing their science, never get down to the root of the subject. They never set forth philology as a problem." I've added a subtitle, Troubling Institutional Grammar, which I intend in a double sense. So the full title is Jewish Studies as Counterlife, Jewish Studies as a Problem to Itself, Troubling Institutional Grammar. My first try for the subtitle was, quote, "The Promise and Burden of And," which could claim at least a couple of fathers. One is the late Philip Roth, who wrote in The Counterlife, "The burden isn't either or consciously choosing from possibilities equally difficult and regrettable. It's and as well. Not the binary and of law and order, or death and taxes, or Babel v'Yerushalayim, but rather additive paratactic and as the syntactic solution to the problem of personal and by extension collective identity. Each of the 5 ands can be read as corresponding to the 5 parts of Roth's novel, if you know it, as if to say, interpretive ongoingness is all that we have. Academic and institutional identities, alas, may not lend themselves so readily to the protean drama of eliminable conjunction. At its most fruitfully diverse, for example, the aggregated structure of modern Jewish studies readily maps onto this conjunctive principle, with its concatenating disciplines, discursive traditions, polities and Gemeinschaften, languages and literatures, scholastic rhetorics of several kinds, and last but not least, personalities, all on display. Just because the and is reprised over and over, however, does not necessarily mean its promise wholly escapes its burden, which is also my burden today in the alternate sense of the word. From philology to supra-grammatical contexts, I invite you for the duration of this talk to consider with me the problematics of conjunction as they impinge upon the institutional structure of Jewish studies. How and why does syntax matter, you may be wondering? Because when Jewish studies says and, it establishes itself on the university's field of operations as a macrostructure in relation to its external linkages and affiliates. Are those to be buttresses or conduits, occasionings for flattening or deepening, familial relation or neighboring? We shall see. As for Nietzsche, I adapt his observation about cultivated resistance to nub or crux toward the beginning of Jewish Studies as Counterlife in order to set forth the academic practice of Jewish studies itself as a problem. From its philological historicist origins in 19th century Germany to its current state in North American colleges and universities, which is what I confined Jewish studies to for the purpose of the book. Had he been acquainted with Israeli cinema, Nietzsche might well have had in mind the dour figure of Talmud scholar Eliezer Shkolnik, protagonist of Herarat Shulayim, known in these parts as Footnote. Ani lo moreh, I'm not a teacher, he roars defiantly over his son's fervent homage to the essence of their share practice. Ani philolog, ani philolog. I'm a philologist. I'm a philologist. By practice, what I have in mind is not so much the institutionalized sense of medical or forensic practice, the continuous exercise of a profession, though of course I do want to preserve that meaning, as the arena of mobilizing tactics over and above regulative strategies, of art de faire, or arts of doing, the French title of Michel de Certeau's celebrated study in cultural theory, The Practice of Everyday Life. With the goal of sketching a tactical intervention in the university's mastery of place, the way it founds and polices its various disciplinary knowledges, I invite us to position the academic practice of Jewish studies as a fully critical enterprise that looks not only back to the intellectual foundations of Wissenschaft des Judentums, but also laterally, across the horizon line of the humanities, and forward to a Jewish studies to come. In my book, I take a principled line. If by Jewish studies we mean something that coincides with the homonymous scholarship identified by Gershom Scholem in two mid-20th century retrospective essays on Jewish studies as the history of Judaism, so be it. But insofar as Scholem himself models for us a revisionary practice in respect to both boundaries and content, a Jewish studies for the 21st century heralds newer horizons, neither disciplinarily fixated on the twin fundaments of history and religion, nor randomly configured like a Joseph Cornell box, but rather intentionally, tactically dialogic. I should confess at the outset that I am conversing and problematizing, as the discourse goes, with you today in what is more or less a post-academic persona. For those of you who know their Thomas Hardy novels, you can call it, or me, Jew the Obscure. Circumstantially positioned, like the aspirational Jude Folly, at an institution's exterior, peering in vicariously, my business today lies not only with the outside of things, but also, and more critically, with their outsidedness, the face they turn outside to others. Which I mean in both a Levinasian and Machinian sense. Returning now, however, to the question of syntax. Another patriarch of the and is Franz Rosenzweig, that also post-academic and determinedly dialectical Jewish thinker, about whose work one commentator has remarked, the notion of conjunction, or das kleine Wort und, the idea of a conjunctive relationship between two terms, which interanimate each other without ever being reducible one to the other, inhabits the movement of his thinking centrally. We see it in the Star of Redemption and the New Thinking, where it projects a narrative middle between unity and chaos, far and near, neighbor and other. It marks, says Rosenzweig himself, quote, the keystone of the edifice constructed on its own pillars. As it happens, the theme of the 2017 Franz Rosenzweig International Conference in Rome was the conjunction and in Franz Rosenzweig's work, I and the Other, Philosophy and Theology, Time and Redemption, Judaism and Christianity. One of the papers delivered there was entitled, Can and be an end in itself? Can and be an end in itself? Here, with Rosenzweig in mind, and to whom we return at the end of this talk, I'm drawn to conjunction rather as an ambivalent beginning, the burden and promise that and encodes vis-a-vis the institutional contours, both grammatical and programmatic, of Jewish studies. Before we tackle them in earnest, I ask your indulgence for a short detour into Hebrew grammar on the very specific matter of vavim. The letter vav in Hebrew signifies, aptly enough, a hook. Both consonant and vowel, it also often acts as a coordinating conjunction. Depending on context, it will signify and, or, nor, but, although, if, then, since, and even. Depending on context, it will signify, Biblical Hebrew distinguishes between two primary syntactic uses of the letter at the beginning of words. The paratactic vav hahibur, the vav of connection, or conjunctive vav, which translates as and, as in, for example, chalav dvash, milk and honey, or in the verb form, na'aseh v'nishma, the Israelites we will do and obey at the foot of Mount Sinai. And second, the temporalizing vav hahipuch, the vav of reversal, or consecutive vav, which indicates preterite or future consequence of actions, inverting the aspect of the verb in the worded prefixes from either imperfect to perfect or perfect to imperfect, as in v'ahavta, and you shall love, in the Shema. Properly speaking, the first vav is a true conjunction, whereas the second vav amounts to a verb construction, a marker for a change in tenses. The primary difference between them lies in conjoining two elements in the first case versus converting an action as a specifically temporal element, used primarily to devote consecution. Although rare, the latter construction was used by modern writers too, including Shmuel Yosef Agnon and in the previous generation, Avraham Mappel. In its modern guise, we can see conjunctive vav at literal work in Yeshiva University's Torah Umada, which, just like rabbinic ikar v'tafel, primary and secondary regarding foodstuffs, instructs us in the politics of coordination. The ordinally subsidiary element that signifies the neutral language of secular inquiry only becomes Hebrew mada, obviously, in relation to Torah. Whether mada is taken to mean the human sciences, the liberal arts, disciplinary knowledges, general education, or Western culture, none of these entities actually comprehends itself that way or in yoked relation to a foundational religious text. Mada, in short, speaks Hebrew, but the thing it is naming in the context it presumes does not. To put a really fine point on it, it's Torah umada, not Torah in the modern. At any rate, just as the conjunctive phrase only epiphenomenally applies to the status of Jewish studies at Yeshiva University, so you would think the differences between the two vavim possessed limited application for the programmatic aspects of Jewish studies, as or in conjunction more generally. Or do they? Construing Jewish studies as a horizontally integrated field. How do I pronounce it? Horizontally. Sleepless in Minneapolis. Horizontally integrated field. The logic of the and allows us to see its problem as grammatical, which in the sense Ludwig Wittgenstein preferred to use, highlights the rule-based structure of language as gameplay. And whatever else, the example of Torah Umada shows that ostensible horizontality intersects with certain vertical implications as well, depending on which of the two coordinate elements is granted priority. So let me suggest to you that creatively applied, the two vavim offer an initial heuristic, which I will render now as a question. When Jewish studies affixes itself to some other academic enterprise, and I am restricting this thought experiment to intramural terrain entirely, when it affiliates or links itself to some institutional other, does it perform the merely additive function of conjunctive vav, or can it, rather, like the vav of reversal, introduce a temporal element, a change in tenses, and altered action? This would be a Jewish studies in time, not merely a diachronic Jewish studies in its dependable guise as historicist reflector, with ever better ways to narrate Jewish history, but a temporalizing Jewish studies, a Jewish studies that in speaking itself, alters itself and makes other. Perhaps we can deepen the problem of conjunction, get to its root, as Nietzsche would say, by imagining other syntactic possibilities for its organizing institutional principles. Hipuch means turn over, reversal, inversion, and also somersault, or roll. As in the famous Mishnah from Tractate Pirkei Avot, introduced to Ben Bagbag, hafoch ba, kuleba, turn it, for everything is in it. Or the climactic moment in Megillat Esther from a week or so ago, and it was reversed. Envisioning a Jewish studies to come would mean both a capacity for nimble movement among its constituent parts and alongside its institutional neighbors, and what I want to call its dialogic imperative, the capacity to engage otherness, even that which inheres within itself. Think of a transformational grammar on a very different plane than, say, Noam Chomsky's, where phrasal adjacency merely initiates a much larger inquiry about affiliation and partnership. How does Jewish studies name itself relationally? What or who might be Jewish studies' academic other, its interanimating conjunct? For now, I ask you simply to hold in your minds the following proposition. What is Jewish studies, if not coordinating and temporalizing conjunction alike? Currently, when Jewish studies programs denominate themselves by means of and, they do so as Vav HaChibur. You now, or will soon, have a list of such programs in front of you. A compilation of 50 Jewish studies mastheads, 23% of the approximately 220 Judaic/Jewish programs. The late Jacob Neusner maintained a difference in terms between Jewish and Judaic, doesn't matter. I strongly demur. In North America, listed on the AJS Directory of Programs in Jewish Studies. They are organized into 5 categories, alphabetized according to name of institution, which I'll quickly summarize, albeit slightly out of sequence, not the institutions, but the categories. You can laugh. You will note that only the 4th and 5th categories gesture in a direction otherwise than a now conventional coupling of Jewish studies with Israel studies and Holocaust studies, or through the more long-standing kinship. I'm sorry, there are probably not enough handouts, so some people have to look up. Yeah. Or through the more long-standing kinship with some Semitic, Near Eastern, and Hebraic peer. Remember also that the formal linkage between Jewish on the one hand and Israel or Holocaust on the other has only evolved over the past few decades since the first convocation in 1969 of the then newly established Association for Jewish Studies, at which point it was certainly not as given or inevitable as it may appear now. Certainly not if Salo Baron had anything to do with it, or Jacob Neusner. If the conjunction of Judaic and Near Eastern studies self-evidently illustrates coordinating conjunction of the Vav HaChibur kind, Judaic, Holocaust, and peace studies, or Jewish and Israel studies do not, as I will explain shortly. The programs grouped together in Category 3 gesture back to a genealogically prior moment for modern Jewish studies, before, during, and immediately after 1900, when diplomatic, archaeological, and linguistic criteria all converged upon lands and their cultures, now named with reference to Europe's centrality, the Near and Far East. In the 20th century, Near, Far, and most especially Middle East gravitated to newer fields like political science. Accordingly, a campus department of Middle Eastern languages and cultures will typically signify a set of intellectual concerns and research areas quite distinct from a department of Near Eastern languages and cultures. For example, the UMass Amherst website describes itself this way. 2 robust programs, one in Judaic studies and the other in Middle Eastern studies, function side by side, both independently and harmoniously, in an atmosphere of shared resources, intellectual traditions, and research methodologies. Judaic remains the consistent term for most of these programs, with a distinction represented by Washington University's Jewish, Islamic, and Near Eastern languages and cultures marks a very clear and very contemporary departure from the default signifier of an earlier vintage. If we turn to the programs that designate themselves with primary reference to Jewish languages, we find a variant of the same logic. behind the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Hebrew and Semitic Studies, which, like its peer, Classical and Ancient Near Eastern Studies, created in 1850, affiliates with the Moss Weinstein Center for Jewish Studies, can still be glimpsed a 19th century genealogy of Old Testamentary scholarship and the Christian divinity schools. Platforms for the other programs that use some combination of Hebrew and Judaic prove similarly instructive. Haverford Bryn Mawr, for example, conjoins the Judaic studies in the one college with the Hebrew language program in the other. Here, the grammar of conjunction matches empirical happenstance precisely. Two institutions, two respective programs, sutured now in combination. All of these programs, even OSU's very far from Near Eastern Yiddish and Ashkenazic studies, conform to a straightforward logic of conjunction. The ligatures make an obvious, non-controversial sense, even when they may capture a now superseded cultural moment in an evolving field, or conjure the spirit of a Wissenschaft des Judentums tradition that cannot help but shadow that same field. In all of these instances, and just means and. Symbolic lessons in the grammar of biblical Hebrew notwithstanding. In category 5, where the hyphen and bullet point do duty for the and, the same object complement studies is shared by coordinate modifiers whose thrust is unambiguously religious, whether ecumenical or evangelical. Along the same lines, I'd point to a recent event at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, where the title says everything. Scholarship across divides, Jewish and Islamic studies in conversation. Category 4 illustrates a more recent genealogy for Jewish studies programs that departs from these older academic protocols of cartography and linguistic tradition. The most intriguing of these, in my opinion, belong to Keene College and San Francisco State, and it is probably no accident that both their uniquely constituted programs expressly look outwards and attach themselves to the non-Jewish, whether expressed as periphery, quote, marginalized communities, end quote, or preponderance, quote, the larger world, end quote. While such programs might be said to gesture toward hipuch, or altered action, they too reside principally on the plane of chibur. That leaves categories 1 and 2, by means of which we enter one of the more vexed terrains in Jewish studies, the related but separate fields of Israel studies and Holocaust studies, both merely emergent when the AJS was created in 1969, crystallizing very quickly into the recognized academic specializations they now denote, and basic to the field's contemporary self-understanding. To give a sense of how recent this development is, the State of Jewish Studies, a book from 1990, lists Hebrew Bible, ancient, medieval, and modern Jewish history, modern Jewish literature, Jewish art, modern Jewish thought, and Jewish education as the subjects comprising the then current state of Jewish studies. Neither Israel nor the Holocaust, among other omissions, is included. By the time Raoul Hilberg's 1961 book, The Destruction of the European Jews, had entered its second edition in 1985, Holocaust studies in North America was consolidating its status as an emergent field, along with the related fields of trauma and genocide studies. Not coincidentally, the 1980s saw the parallel upsurge of Israel studies as a multidisciplinary research area in its own right. While the title of the 212 book by Miriam Shenkar, The Politicization of Israel Studies, suggests that the field has gradually, or even inescapably, come to be politicized, I think we could agree that both Israel studies and Holocaust studies inhabit a political sphere, are pervaded by political concerns, constructs, narratives, and judgments, and inscribe the political as the double plane on which their work is transacted, both in relation to their nominal subjects and to the academy itself as an arena for teaching and research on the one hand, and advocacy and community investment and outreach on the other. But even more immediately, though perhaps not as obviously, Holocaust studies and Israel studies had a decisive political torque to Jewish studies as their conjunct in common. To that degree, HS and IS represent structural limit cases for JS in conjunction, which merely underscore the striated, disciplinarily politicized nature of Jewish studies in the first place. I want to repeat that sentence. To that degree, Holocaust studies and Israel studies represent structural limit cases for Jewish studies in conjunction, which merely underscore the striated, disciplinarily politicized nature of Jewish studies in the first place. A number of Jewish studies programs must contend with the practical difficulties incurred within a scarcity economy, when initiatives for Israel or Holocaust-related research do not neatly coincide with the various boundaries, budgeting and otherwise, within which those programs operate. At Emory University, for example, where my distinguished wife is affiliated, the Institute for the Study of Modern Israel, ISM, established 1998, and the Holocaust Denial on Trial Initiative, HDOT, established 2005, each driven by an individual faculty member, partner, as the locution goes, with the university and its Institute for Jewish Studies, while functioning and moreover being funded semi-autonomously. The following observation from an essay about Israel studies in the Bloomsbury Companion to Jewish Studies offers a telling insight into the precarity of conjunction. I quote. And you can find all of the long quotations that I'll make in this talk on the final page of that handout, so you can follow along. In particular, a degree of protectiveness and even resentment has surfaced among some long-standing Jewish studies members as Israel studies has emerged as a growth area. In their eyes, Israel studies is an upstart, promoted by community members and non-academic interests, and when added to the curriculum, threatens to overwhelm less fashionable subjects while draining budgets needed to sustain more traditional Jewish studies curriculum. This is from 2013. The article is only 6 years old. Here in parallel is a brief genealogy for Holocaust studies from 2011. Begun in the 1970s, Holocaust studies has continued to grow and evolve as a particularly fraught domain of research and investigation. Dominated by historians since its inception, the field has constantly grappled with the meaning and methods of its practice. The tension between historians who seek to uncover, quote, what really happened, end quote, and a variety of scholars of other orientations, both inside and outside the discipline of history, who attempt to craft and apply theoretical frameworks, with scholars of representation falling somewhere in between. Intersecting disciplines like literature, philosophy, religion, and sociology also have had a more difficult time gaining a foothold. Accelerated growth distinguishes Holocaust studies and Israel studies as a hallmark, and explains some of the structural tension which attaches to both, like 2 centuries of Wissenschaft des Judentums compressed into as many decades. Each, as it were, subsists within its own highly ionized field of ample funding and popular subject matter, faculty prestige, and community buy-in. The pressures each exerts on or within Jewish studies proves instructive, we might say even uncanny. Frankly, Jewish studies and the uncanny, as its own conjunction, may well count as the most foundational and influential and of them all, in my opinion, although I do not believe any current program formally boasts such nomenclature. I'm waiting for it, though. Excuse me. You couldn't have opened it? An example can be found in the Schenker monograph I mentioned earlier, The Politicization of Israel Studies, where in a chapter about the genesis of Columbia's Center for Israel and Jewish Studies in the 1950s, we are briefly introduced to the figure of Dan Miron, preeminent scholar of Hebrew and Yiddish literature, currently affiliated with Columbia University's Department of Middle East and Asian Languages and Cultures, Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies, MILAC and MISAS, and last but not least, the Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies, IIJS. As a matter of record, Israel appears in that program titled decades in advance of Israel studies as an emergent field for two reasons. One, to honor an initial grant from the Jewish Agency in 1950, and two, because Salo Baron wished to make the program's classes accessible to Israeli diplomats at the UN. Even when leadership passed out of Baron's hands into those of Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, Israel studies as such had yet to come fully into its own. In 2006, the Center for Israel and Jewish Studies was refashioned as the Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies, in part to enable joint appointments with other departments. That Middle Eastern studies at Columbia eventually became a flashpoint for Israel-Palestine politics is a development that merely parallels rather than follows from the inclusion of the proper name Israel in Columbia's Jewish Studies program, which no doubt carried certain personal resonances for Don Miron once he made the transition from Hebrew University to the American Academy. Miron is the author, among other esteemed titles, of the massive treatise on the Jewish literary complex, entitled From Continuity to Contiguity, Toward a New Jewish Literary Thinking, published in 2010 by Stanford. The brief treatment of Miron in Shankar's book on Israel studies makes no mention of his scholarship, however. Rather, it focuses entirely on his presence in the program amidst increasing friction between faculty and Jewish student groups associated with Middle Eastern studies on the one hand, and those associated with the Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies on the other, with conflict over Israel and Palestine, not surprisingly, at the politicized center. In his own book about the very differently political terrain of literary history, Miron introduces the concept of contiguity at the conclusion of a long series of entailments that distinguish his new thinking about modern Hebrew and Yiddish literary traditions from an earlier school of criticism that, even at the cost of descriptive or definitional accuracy, stressed continuity, homogeneity, and regulative order. By contrast, contiguity signifies a less causal or linear logic of association for Jewish literatures globally. And this is the passage from Miron that's on the final page that I'm quoting. Vast, disorderly, and somewhat diffuse, this complex the Jewish literary complex was characterized by dualities, parallelisms, occasional intersections, marginal overlapping, hybrids, similarities within dissimilarities, mobility, changeability, occasional emergence of patterns and their eventual disappearance, randomness, and when approximating a semblance of significant order, contiguities. Now, the semantics of contiguity do happen to find something of a parallel with the syntactics of conjunction in Biblical Hebrew's consecutive conjunctive vavim. A continuous relationship is a temporal relationship, preterite and future linked through some form of consecution. A contiguous or adjacent relationship functions like a conjunctive one, its elements linked paratactically. And yes, with occasional intersections and marginal overlappings, Jewish studies does thrive in its own somewhat diffuse interdisciplinary world. Yet that's about as far as I would be willing to go in suggesting any connection between the Jewish literary complex, on the one hand, and a modern Jewish studies complex on the other. This is only to say that the and between Jewish on the one hand and Israel or Holocaust on the other neither solves or obviates a problem. I think it fair to say that it introduces or pronounces one, a freighted proximity between continuous and or contiguous signifiers. In one of a small genre of essays that think the transdisciplinary problem of Holocaust studies, not the problem of representation, of historiography, of testimony, of translation, of national and cultural identities, but the meta-problem of the field, which is also my concern with you today. Pavel Wolski argues that, quote, the discipline itself creates its own identity on a more competitive than conciliatory level, even when it takes part in a wider trend within human studies in general, or employs notions, methods, and tools taken from other disciplines. Marjorie Garver, a former teacher of mine at Harvard University and the author of Academic Interests, a book called Academic Instincts, calls that particular tendency disciplinary libido. Like Jewish studies itself, Holocaust studies locates itself both inside and outside a conventional array of disciplines and their vocabularies. Indeed, it is precisely this drive towards discursive autonomy, one of the most common of modern academic instincts, that makes any ready-made coalescence between Holocaust studies or Israel studies with Jewish studies elusive, both differing and deferred. And yes, if you hear the ghost of Derrida in the background, you should. Indeed, I think it fair to say that both Holocaust studies and Israel studies reproduce problems of self-definition that have already made the Jewish its own limit case vis-a-vis the rest of the academy and its various proprietary disciplinary knowledges. Whether we couple JS with HS and IS, conjoin the Judaic and the Near Eastern, or hinge the Jewish to the Christian and Islamic, we still must reckon with Rosenzweig's elevated standard. Does die vertatsächlichende Macht das Und, the actualizing power of the and, underpin the respective projects we coordinate in conjunction, or does it just say and, the plus sign between two addends? At the beginning of this presentation, I wondered with you out loud, what is JS, if not coordinating and temporalizing conjunction alike? Suppose now that we retool this question ever so slightly. Reflecting on the importance that Rosenzweig's work has had for him, Emmanuel Levinas observes that the conjunction and is not a formal and empty category, the union of two terms which we can perceive from the outside. What Rosenzweig's and really means is for, Levinas says. The essential point is played out in this for, in which both elements live, not in this and. By conjoining, and inhabits a grammatical flat space. Exchanging the conjunctive for the quasi-prepositional, for introduces a depth relation and makes the more intentional case for both linkage, for linkage even beyond the exclusively Jewish. I am less philosophically ambitious than Rosenzweig, yet for the purposes of this talk, positioned with you, at least for the moment, as he eventually was not within the university's Dalet Amot, its 4 cubits and its 4 walls, but in my capacity as aspirant on behalf of academic Jewish studies, I want to import this notion of dynamic junction, as Levinas puts it, over and above static conjuncture. Think of the and as plotted on a 2-dimensional coordinate system. An x-axis of multi or transdisciplinarity, and a y-axis of external affiliation, where, as Levinas will say of Torah, it lays claim to an outside by listening to what comes from outside. Moving from Cartesian to Euclidean space, so to speak, what would Jewish studies for X, instead of Jewish studies and X, look like? Not quite like Rosenzweig's own Freies Lehrhaus Judaica, which was intended to thrive heterotopically, outside the academy's walls, not within them. Intramurally, it's difficult to surpass Susanna Heschel's formulation for Jewish studies, modern Jewish studies, as a reading of and through Jewish studies, a reading necessarily against the grain that dislodges convenient categories by revealing the limitations of their applicability. In other words, a critical Jewish studies on the well-established models of critical legal studies or critical race studies. In that spirit, I ask again, as an admittedly challenging inquiry, what would Jewish studies for X, rather than Jewish studies and X, look like? How might Jewish studies position itself in the space of the other? It's also a question that exponents of the conventionally historicist Jewish studies would probably deflect as entirely irrelevant for the historians in the room, misguided, or worse, interfering in the fundamental tasks for a post-Wissenschaft des Judentums, Jewish studies, as spelled out by Gershom Scholem half a century ago. Here, for example, is the view from philology, as expressed by our saturnine and contumelious friend, Professor Eliezer Shkolnik.
נניח שנינו מתעסקים בחרסים, כן? כלי חרש אומרים. האחד מתבונן בחרסים הללו, מנקה אותם בקפידה, מקטלג ומסדר אותם, מודד אותם בצורה מדעית ומדויקת, מנסה לפענח מאיזה תקופה הם ומי יצר.
Well, I guess he was cut short, but you'll find his quotation on the last, the final quotation in the, too bad, but the connection is separate. I'm not going to approximate the Hebrew, so I'll read it in English. One of us examines these potsherds, cleans them meticulously, catalogs them, measures them scientifically and precisely, tries to decipher which period they're from and who made them. And if he succeeds, he has done his work properly. And it has scientific value for generations. The other looks at the potsherds for a few seconds, sees they're more or less the same color, and immediately makes a pot out of them. The potsherds may be from different periods. They may not exactly match. Main thing is he has a pot. The pot is very nice, very attractive. But it has nothing to do with scientific truth. It is an empty vessel, an illusion, a tower with no foundation. And the interviewer responds, sounds like this pot really annoys you. There is no pot. That's the point. It's fiction. You can't be annoyed with something that doesn't exist. That my own mind goes to unintended echoes of Walter Benjamin or Kabbalah would mark me as a perfect proxy for such wissenschaftlich disdain. There is no pot. That's the point, it's fiction. And yet if we propose something like this image of a vessel assembled from discontinuous or disjunctive fragments, or contiguous fragments for that matter, as a descriptively useful schema for either Jewish studies in itself or Jewish studies as a component of a greater academic humanities, then fiction is hardly such a disreputable thing. To tell the truth, it's a perfectly serviceable name for a Jewish studies to come. A Jewish studies as if, the aspirational and that also means for. And even if Benjamin has some immediate relevance after all, as another exponent of conjunctive and, as the very sign of relationality, of conjunctive and as the very sign of relationality, I will confess that Shkolnik's metaphor does conjure the famous fragmented vessel image for translation from Benjamin's famous and oft-cited The Task of the Translator essay. The potsherds may be from different periods. They may not exactly match. The main thing is he has a pot. Et voila. Modern Jewish studies captured in a nutshell, or rather vessel. The tessellated condition of the greater humanities would apply as well, in which Jewish studies has its own partial but connective part to play. The pot is very nice, very attractive, but it has nothing to do with scientific truth. True again, if we are willing to grant that both Jewish studies and the humanities alike, as integrative enterprises, conduce to something beyond the desideratum of scientific truth as unreconstructed Wissenschaft. In footnote, the recurrent keyword to figure its exponents and practitioners is Metsudah, fortress, juxtaposed at one point with words in the same semantic neighborhood like Magen, Machzeh, and Malkodet, shield, shelter, and last but not least, trap. An alternate metaphor, perhaps. But let's keep things simple and stay with one conceit at a time. I have already invited us to imagine alternate syntactic possibilities for the organizing principles of Jewish studies, perhaps along the lines of Vav HaHipuch, perhaps grammatically otherwise. As I've already gestured in this direction, and if we give our aspirational desires full range, imagine a program called Jewish Studies and the Humanities. Humanities understood in the broadest contemporary sense, which includes the social sciences, where the conjunction expressly aspires to altered action, the entire project of Jewish studies being inflected at the largest scale, as the humanities gets refracted in turn. Or in similar fashion, Jewish studies in public life, modeled on the relatively new trend of symposia on the humanities in public life, and a 2014 volume from Fordham University Press, and a book series from University of Iowa Press of the same name. No interdiscipline in the contemporary university names itself as such, of course. Not women's studies, not any of the minority interdisciplines, not any of the area disciplines. And whether wanting it to do so has genuine warrant. The point of such a thought experiment would be to enframe Jewish studies as an outside, a Jewish studies with surplus, a Jewish studies in time, an intentionally counter-insular enterprise, transacted otherwise than Jews talking about predominantly to or about other Jews. Only slightly less messianically, I could also envision a brave new world for Jewish studies, with apologies to Professor Shuat, under the heading Jewish Studies in Theory. A 2013 symposium sponsored by Duke and UNC Chapel Hill, Jews and the Ends of Theory, offers a model with a riot of conjunction under various rubrics in the descriptive blur. Jews and Marxism, Jews and the avant-garde, Jews and modernism, Jews and the nation, Jews and abstraction. That would mark the point where the practice of Jewish studies, to which I called attention at the beginning of this talk as an acte de faire, a tactical intervention, meets the altered action to which a critical Jewish studies will or should aspire. If I had to put my money on just one conjunct alone, again apologies, it would be Jewish Studies in Theory. I can't say whether it makes for the nicest or most attractive pot, but it very likely holds out the greatest promise of and as a creative exercise in institutional ground, for an enterprise that, as generally practiced, tends, if anything, to be under-theorized. If I draw a boundary line, that is not yet to say why I am drawing it, wrote Ludwig Wittgenstein. In order to contain, differentiate, or exclude something, we might reasonably speculate. But it may also be part of a game Wittgenstein insists, and the players be supposed, say, to jump over the boundary. Like the language game of mathematics, for instance, where a boundary marks the place where signs can change their value. It was in a similar spirit that Levinas read conjunctive and as pointing the way to quasi-prepositional for. So let me conclude now with a similar leap forward into the grammatically otherwise. Take and out of the equation entirely, scrap it. For Jewish studies problem has never really been that of conjunction anyway. Rather, it has had primarily to do with location and orientation, a spatial, temporal, cartographic problem. To the now dated but then purportedly conclusive question, where does Jewish studies belong? The title of a 1976 article in the Journal of the Academic Academy of Religion. Let me now propose an answer in such a way as to exceed the thrust of the original question entirely. By the way, the answer to that question was religious studies. Jewish studies belongs to the Department of Religious Studies. Its proper disciplinary home or partner is not the essential problem for Jewish studies to solve. Where does Jewish studies belong? In context, in motion or in time, across boundaries, through and against itself, towards its others, as critique. In the 1937 interview, Isaac Babel remarked that were he ever to write an autobiography, he would call it the story of an adjective. In Roth's The Ghostwriter, narrator Nathan Zuckerman quotes the very same mot juste. I have suggested today that, faced with a similar task, and as much more than the story of a proper name, the 21st century practice of Jewish studies will avail itself of alternate parts of speech in order to tell its proper tale. Narratively and grammatically alike, I would like to believe that these are choices still in the making. Speaking, that is, as an aspirant by proxy, in which spirit I thank you again for your time and attention today.
Thank you, Adam, and I'm also very glad that you invoked the battle between the historians and the literary scholars. We have about, by the way, 10 or 15 minutes of dissertation defense it will be coming in for 2 o'clock, but I think we can take about 10 minutes and then quickly wrap up with food. So I call on Gary.
I should say I'm a historian, and I'm going to ask what might sound like a more workaday question than what perhaps Bruno might pose at this stage. I appreciate it very much that you raised a number of issues and challenges that Jewish studies as a field faces. There's one that concerns me that was implicit in much of what you said, and you came close maybe toward the end with location, but you did not explicitly analyze. And that is, to what extent are there factors and features and qualities of Jewish studies as an interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary enterprise, both intellectually and institutionally, that are specific to Jewish studies, that are unique to Jewish studies, as compared to those challenges, those problems, whether intellectual or institutional, that Jewish studies, like any interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary field, faces in the academy or in the universities as we know them.
So look, one of the things that I start out by saying in the book, or acknowledging, is that as a hybridic entity, as an interdisciplinary, or frankly I would prefer to say interdiscursive enterprise, among many in the academy today. I mean, Garber, whom I quoted earlier, remarks in her book that once upon a time studies meant intentionally and deliberately something that actually tried to think over and transcend disciplinarity. But we've ironically reached a moment in the academy where studies programs have just over-proliferated them, and they all mimic each other to a certain extent, or try to do the same things. But the fact of the matter is, Jewish studies is unique. There is no other academic entity that, diachronically speaking at least, stretches back to the Bronze Age and tracks and traces an arc to the current moment and forms a kind of hub through which any number of disciplines in the humanities and the social studies and social sciences meet. So yes, to that extent it's actually unique, but to that extent it's actually also paradigmatic. It has a sort of work to perform for the larger academy that it never quite has taken on because its energy has often been spent, understandably, in defensive and apologetic ways. Not to mention the fact that it's really had two geneses, right? There's Wissenschaft des Judentums, which is what Gershom Scholem understood to be Jewish studies in the two essays they talked about. And there's the Jewish studies of the 1960s, which essentially sort of rubbed shoulders with what was then called black studies. And any number of ethnocultural studies programs that have developed since then, where the object of scrutiny was hardly religious or historiographic. And as I said, I mean, if you think that, if you acknowledge that Jewish studies has had two geneses, then any Deuteronomic retelling of it, any critique or attempt to kind of address Jewish studies, must also come to grips with that unique aspect of it. So I agree with you entirely. It has a very special role to play in the academy. My suggestion in this book is that it be in the vanguard. It's that it modeled for the academy any number of moves, like the ones that I tried to execute and perform today, that other relational programs can do in kind. I hope that.
Good. So I'm going to have Bruno be probably the last word and question, and then we'll have a bit of time to continue this informally over the last bit of food. So Bruno.
Okay. Thank you so much for spectacular lecture.
Oh,
can you talk a little bit, return a little bit on Levinas, because I understand Levinas and the I and the other, the self and other, more in terms of interpersonality, but you seem to use it almost metaphorically or in displacing it toward the relation, a sort of disciplinary or institutional relation.
Exactly so.
Right? Can you? I'm not sure that this can work. But
so, one of the reasons I'm probably not in the academy anymore is that my work has been quixotic from the start. I have used thinkers like Bakhtin and Levinas to think the problem of the interpersonal at the level of the institutional and the interdiscursive. So when I wrote Facing Black and Jew, for instance, I used both Bakhtinian and Levinasian notions of interpersonal ethical relation to talk about the constituencies at large of African American and Jewish American literary production as faced at each other as if they were selves, who were ethically obligated to one another. I did the same thing in my book about Levinas and Yeshiyahu Leibovitz as two philosophers who are remarkably similar, though radically dissimilar, whom I position in relation to each other as if they were facing. So, in this book, I think the problem of Jewish studies in a sort of Levinasian way as bothered by otherness, the alterity of the academy, the alterity within itself, the alterity of like-minded projects which are actually quite different. And in the spirit of Levinas, tried to think that problem, as not only a problem, not only one of institutional ecology, but one of ethics. And again, I say that as a post-academic. I look at the academy now with sort of somewhat oblique eyes, freed from, for better or worse, from my own disciplinary home and embeddedness, so that I'm kind of in a position to sort of think about the problem of embeddedness and insularity in the largest most term, or the largest terms, as a kind of meta-theoretical problem. And so when I looked at you and mentioned theory, I'm not really talking about theory as post-structuralism. I'm talking about Jewish studies as a historicist project, an institutional enterprise that has yet to really theorize itself, its place in the academy. That's what this book is about.
And for that,